Hello and welcome to another Retropower Uncut, and I'm going to start this one with a little bit of a look round our sort of newer part of our facility. One of the reasons being that we're a little light on content this week because of the fact that the Utah Mark II Jaguar actually ended up having to stay down at the rolling road. If you watched last week's episode, you'll know that we were all geared up and nervous about the fact it was going to rolling road mapping. Now we got it down there on the Thursday when we filmed the last episode, and it went fine actually. We got all the initial setup done, we got it strapped down to the rollers, did some initial just fettling, running up through the gears, making sure everything was working as it should, and that was all fine. We noticed a little anomaly with the ignition timing, and it turned out the crank offset number wasn't set quite right. So the number that was entered into the ECU for ignition timing was not the real value, because essentially the ECU, the setting that you put into the ECU so it knows where top dead center on 1 is, which is its crank position reference, was slightly out. So we tweaked that. Happy with that. We then had the idle hanging up slightly, so we had to make a bit of a tweak to the throttle linkage, and by the time we'd done that we were pretty much running out of time, so we left it on the rollers to carry on the Friday, and then unfortunately on the Friday Alex couldn't make it over, and then over the course of the weekend he got quite poorly, and he did a negative COVID test, but he was still pretty rough, so he's awaiting the results of another test, and we're trying to decide whether it's COVID or whether it's just a really bad cold at the minute. So I'm awaiting the results of his second test, but I'm hoping that by the end of this week he'll be on the mend, and then hopefully Monday next week we can carry on. Now, as it is, Roger Clark Motorsport didn't have anything else on the rollers, so we've just been able to leave the car down there on the rollers, so we can just pick up where we left off. But consequently, there's nothing I can really show you about what's gone on with that. So I thought I'd give you a little show around. So this is the reception area, which we revamped probably earlier this year. It seems like ages ago, but time flies. This is our engine build room, which we don't use massively. We tend to send a lot of engine build work out to other people, you know, when it's trusted people. Paul Exon does some work for us, Roy Millington or Julian Millington do some work for us. But we do the odd engine build, and that's where we do it. Nice clean room for that. And then earlier this year also, when we did the revamp of reception, we built this room, which I think we did show in a previous episode. But this is basically somewhere quiet where we can take customers and talk through ideas and show them renderings, show them design ideas, and just a nice, calm, comfortable place to sit down and chat to customers. We've got some pictures on the wall just behind the camera there, which sort of represent, I would say, key moments in the history of Retropower. So probably our first full build, I would say, which is the Ascona 400 at the end here. Obviously Gordon Murray being a pretty key thing that went on during our history. The Jag XJC, which I would say was our first sort of luxury car build, our first full bespoke interior build right over there, which you probably can't see. Jamie's trying to navigate his way around without knocking everything over. One of our longest standing customers, and a chap we've built 4 cars for now, I think, there, and also his Alfa Romeo at the end there, which was probably one of our landmark builds that was a real next level up for us. So that's this room. Let's have a little look out this way, and we'll see where the result of the various changes we've been making, where we've built the mezzanine and moved all the parts storage up, it's also freed up an upstairs room which was largely being used for parts storage here. So this room, for the first time in a long time, rather than being a massive clutter of car parts, is now an office space. And the plan here is that this is going to be Adam's office space. He's our workshop manager, he'll sit at the end there, and then largely used as a CAD studio. Since George is in here, there will be a second CAD station next to that, which is the one that all of the other guys here who work on CAD would share. There never tends to be more than 2 people doing CAD work at the same time. There's always at least one. And that's something that's sort of evolved over the last few years, is the amount of parts design that we're doing. So we really need a suitable space, and that is this. Quick mention out to Darren at Motive Culture. He just sent us these posters which we got in the post today. Obviously knows what sort of things we like, because these are probably 3 cars that unanimously everybody here would say were awesome cars from the Group B rally days. Quattro, Delta S4 and a 205 T16, so we're going to get some frames for those, and there'll be a nice little feature on the wall down there, I think. If you come this way, actually I should mention that table, when the posters aren't on it, is our packaging table. So any merch packaging is done by me. We're not at that stage like some of these guys where they have people doing all their merch stuff for them. We've literally got a rail in there with some clothes on, a box of mugs, and I come up and pack them up. So this is the mezzanine we spent the last few months, well, I say months actually, it was probably only the last few weeks, building, and this is where now all of our car part storage is. There's a little bit of organising to do here, because it's essentially, we've just moved everything that was on those shelves up here. And at some point in the next few weeks, we're going to try and find a couple of days to just go through everything and make sure everything's as organised as it can be. And the aim is to sort of improve that organisation going forward. But it's amazing to have this space now, and it allows us to keep everything more organised here and keep everything cleaner in the workshop. What I will mention, just because it's in the corner of my eye, is everybody asks us about our own projects all the time and our own cars. And of course, almost everybody here has got some kind of project on the go. Usually ones where they don't find enough time to work on them because we're too busy working on other people's cars. Not Jamie behind the camera, he's looking very smug because he's got a Toyota Celica GC4 that he's just bought in a perfect working condition, which is unusual for us. This, I'm actually in 2 minds. It's an E36 M3 engine, and I bought it with the intention of putting it into my E30 Touring that I've got, which is currently running an M42 4-cylinder on throttle bodies. I thought about putting this in it, but I've also got an E36 Coupe that I have already stripped down with the intention of putting a V8 in for track use. I'm now wondering about putting this into that. It seems more in keeping, because when I built the E30 Touring, the reason I used the 4-cylinder was with the throttle bodies was because I wanted the same power as a 325 but less weight, and the weight distributed further back, and it achieves exactly that. And I feel now, although I got all excited and got this, I'm thinking now it kind of goes against that original principle I had, and maybe it would be better in the E36. So I think I might keep the 4-cylinder in the E30, stick this in the E36, but in terms of the amount of time I have to work on my own projects, all of these things are going to be over a number of years, probably 10-year projects, so we'll perhaps show them when I actually get them that far. We'll come back down here. Obviously we now have an amazing view of the assembly shop from up on this mezzanine. The RS2000 is hiding under the cover there with the yellow pinstripe, which Nat mentioned before. It's a Mark II RS2000 slant front Escort that had a Group 1 conversion from new, and it's been with the same owner from new, who still owns it. We were commissioned to restore that a couple of years ago. It's barely been used actually. It's come back for a gearbox change, because when we built it to the more or less the original specification, which had a 4.1 diff ratio and a 4-speed gearbox. And the owner having done a couple of short drives in it, for road use, he said it is a bit short geared. So we've got that back, and we're just waiting for a 5-speed box to be built for it. So we're going to put an uprated Type 9 5-speed box in it, but keep the diff ratio the same, which will just give us it gives us quite a tall fifth, because at the moment the 4th gear is 1-to-1 in this at the moment, so it's got a 1-to-1 4th and a 4.1 diff, which does make it very short. So it'll have an overdriven 5th, which should just give you a nice cruising gear, although it'll still be relatively short. So that's what that's here for. Let's have a venture down here. And the other thing that we're working on at the moment and have been doing for quite a while is the Chevette. So this spent most of this week and probably the very tail end of last week back in the paint booth, because we were going to do the wet sanding and polishing on the paint. Now, historically, we've always done that when the shell was finished immediately after paint. We'd do that before it came in here. With hindsight now, we've decided to leave it a little further through the assembly process, because it minimises any chance of scratching, etc. And now it's very rare that we scratch anything badly enough to have to do any repaint, but when you've done a perfect polishing job, any tiny little movements of dirt and even pulling a cover over it, if it's got any dust on it, scratches the surface slightly, and it makes more sense to leave it further down the line to do the polishing, so there's less minor scratching to get out with the detailer at the end. So we had that next door. Gaz and Steve have been working on this, and the process there is basically wet sanding it with 1500 grit, then moving down to 2000 grit, keeping plenty of water on the surface just so it keeps the sandpaper clear, don't get any clogging in there which tends to leave scoring marks in it. And then once they've done that, move on to compound on a polishing head, usually a couple of different grades, starting with a coarser one, moving on to a finer one. We use a bit of a mixture of products, but I think they're using Farecla stuff on this at the moment. I'll find out exactly what it was and put the detail in the description on the video. And with that done, it's back in here and we can carry on with where we left off, which was James doing the carbon trim panels. He templated these a while back. And so it's basically transferring the templates over onto the carbon sheet that we had laid up for it, cushioning them out, trial fitting them, drilling all the bolt holes, and there's inevitably a little bit of fettling of the holes to get everything to line up absolutely bang on. So we're going through that process at the minute. I think the wiring loom had already arrived last time, so that's now loosely in. I was waiting to put the remaining body panels on because the wiring actually routes behind this wing. I've got to carry on now and just start tidying up the wiring properly and starting to terminate the things that it connects to. But we're really in that full steam ahead stage on this now. The engine management loom's being dropped off next week. I'm going to get the headlining in soon because that's got to go in before the rear windows. And it should just really pick up some momentum now, I think. James has been working also on the other remaining job before the dash was flocked. You've probably noticed the disgusting brown dash that's been in it, even whilst it's been black like this. And we're making some carbon panels that actually blank off the apertures in that dash because we've got the Motec digital screen. And I didn't want to do that before flocking the dash for risk of damaging the flocking, but I also didn't want to make those carbon panels until we'd done the trim panels because we're making them from offcuts from the same piece of carbon fibre. So with all the trim panels marked out, James was then able to cut the sections to blank the dash. He's been making some brackets for those. It's a remarkably complicated job. There's nothing really to attach anything to. In fact, the instrument panel, which is one of the biggest blank pieces we're doing, was originally essentially just shoved in, and that's how it was from Vauxhall. It just basically pushes into the gap and there's a tight fit. Obviously a single thickness of carbon fibre, we can't just push it in and jam it in there, it's not really acceptable. So we've done a plasma cut bracket that bolts into the same, in fact he's put some riv nuts in the metal frame on the back of the dash, made a plasma cut bracket that bolts into those, and then there's an intermediate bracket each side which is formed and bent and bonded to the back of the carbon fibre and then in turn bolts onto that main bracket, which seems an incredible amount of work just to mount a flat piece of carbon fibre, but it's really the only way to go about it. So that's done. With those panels done, we can now get the dash flocked, and then yeah, it's all going to start falling into place. Trim panels will be in, get the dash back from flocking, that can go in, we can finish all the wiring before that goes in. The mount for the Motec pad will come back from anodising, and yeah, everything should just start to fall into place. The steering wheel, which has been on order for a month I think now as well, which still isn't here, but I think I got an update on the delivery date for that, which was about a week's time I think, so you'll have to wait and see what we've got in terms of the steering wheel, but it is just an off-the-shelf one. Yeah, and that's where we're at. So on that note, I'll hand over to Nat to carry on and fill you in on the metalwork.
Well, welcome to the Fabrication Workshop for another episode of Retropower Uncut from the dark side. And we'll move on round to the Land Cruiser, because Tom's been carrying on with the very latter stages of that now. Onto the Bonnet. He's been working on the Bonnet, which had some grot along the front and needed a bit of repair work doing for basically only at the front edge. It was actually quite good. We looked at new panels. In fact, we went as far as getting a repaired replacement panel, and then we discovered that actually the repaired replacement panel wasn't that great. As is always the way, you buy something and discover it's a bit disappointing. So we decided to repair the one we've got. and set about the best way of doing that was to unpick the front and go from there. So I'll hand over to Tom for a minute just to explain how he attacked dealing with the front of the bonnet. He can give you a little run through with that, and then I'll pick up after Tom. So over to Tom.
So onto the bonnet now. So basically this front edge, this front part of the bonnet, the nose section was sort of rusted. Had this on the inside as well, this stiffener oil. This wasn't too bad, but it was, it wasn't brilliant. There's a section in the middle that was actually quite bad, so chopped that out, put a new section in that, got that ready to go back in. And then I started doing a front section out of one piece, but didn't get very far with it because I was doing it with the shrinker and stretchers and stuff like that, and it just wasn't going well. There's quite a lot of damage. Couldn't get the radiuses just right, and then working the radiuses to get them right, I was putting more damage in to clean out again, and it just seemed like a lot of work, and there was a lot of tension in this panel, so there's more risk when it comes to welding it into that, of it sort of twisting and distorting and whatever. So basically shape profiled the front of that, cut out just a blank, and then welded the flange on, and then I've just been off and on with that with the bonnet, trimming, marking, and now this morning I've managed to get it all lined up nice, and I've just started tacking it on now, and then gonna weld it later on today and see how it goes.
Right, so Tom finished welding Tom went to start welding the front of the bonnet. That's where he's left off. What he'd then done is he trimmed all the section in, got the edges all matched all the way across, so you can imagine, you can't actually see it on here now, but obviously he'd got his edge matched all the way across, as you saw on the clip. And then he's done his, I'll go back over the old story again, but he's done his tack, wait for it to cool, tap it up, tack an inch along, wait for it to cool, tap it up, all the way along, keeping his gap all the way along, all even. Very lengthy, time-consuming process, but it's all tacked up all the way along, even gap all the way along, so no fluctuations and variations in amount of filler rod applied. And then he's welded it all the way along. Just start at one side, weld all the way along, weld to the other. I think he was kicking himself because he had to put a tiny bit of extra filler rod in on one spot somewhere around one of these two corners, I think. So he got a tiny bit more shrinkage there. But it's not a problem. As long as you know where you put it, you can tap that bit up a bit more. Which then leads me on to, once he welded all that, he then gone along with a planishing hammer and a dolly all the way along the back and tapped up that whole weld seam, planished that all the way along, stretching it all the way along till the shape went back to where it started, concentrating a little bit more effort on stretching the areas where there was a bit more shrink, i.e. where he'd had to put a tiny bit more filler rod, stretched that all back, and then the next stage on, once you've stretched it all back to shape by hammering it on the dolly, that to get the shape of the material back to where it should be, so there's no short areas, it's not any shorter than it was originally anywhere, so there's no big dips caused by it being short. He's then gone along with a dolly and a slapper, which is a lot more gentle than a hammer and obviously a lot flatter than even a fairly flat hammer, and that spreads the material very evenly, and it picks off a number of high spots in one hit with a slapper, so you can actually level out a bigger area in one go, and it's a lot gentler and more gradual in its action. So he goes along with that, and that stretches the whole area a little bit more and brings the weld seam up a little bit more again on the dolly. Once he's done that, he'll do a pass like that, and then he'll go over it with a body file. He'll file that, and the file immediately indicates any high areas. So he'll file, don't go wild with the file, so it's not actually you're not removing too much material, but it highlights all the high areas. Then you go back over again and you tap down using a dolly again, a flat dolly and a slapper on the other side, you tap down all the high areas where the file's taken an amount of material off, knock down all those high areas, then file it again. Do probably 3 or 4 passes over it like that, just taking down all the high spots, filing it to show you the new high spots, taking them down. By the time you've done that 3 or 4 times, then your file's pretty much contacting everything over the front, so you know you're pretty close, and then it's just sand it off, and he's just DA'd the surface of that off, and as you can see, it's pretty good. It's not perfect, there will be a skim of filler over that, but barely any. There's almost no fluctuations in it. So that's a proper panel repair. As I say, there's no welding in dribs and drabs. It's just welded across. I mean, at that point, I'll pick up a couple of points. I've read a few of the comments actually, and there's a couple of points I'll just pick up on there. One going back a few weeks, probably 2 or 3 weeks, was somebody had commented about, not every man at home can afford a TIG welder, and a lot of us have to make do with MIG. That is and isn't true. There are a lot of times, it depends on the type of work you're doing at home. If you're doing clean metal work, actually I would buy a TIG, not a MIG, and you can get an entry-level scratch start, not even HF start. You don't need the HF start. Scratch start will be fine for mild steel work. If you break a bit of the tungsten, it's not the end of the world when you're doing body repair work. A cheap scratch start TIG is no more expensive than a cheap MIG welder. If anything, it can be cheaper if you just go normal air-cooled torch, really simple setup, little gas bottle. Gas is not expensive. There are companies that will do a bottle of gas for £20 for a fill for a large bottle for pure argon, and you know, a £5 a month, £6 a month, something like that rental on a bottle. They're not expensive. The gas isn't expensive. It's no more expensive than MIG gas really. It's about £5 a bottle more expensive than MIG gas. So anybody can do it at home. And a cheap TIG set is perfectly viable. If you can afford a MIG set, you can afford a TIG set. I accept that there are jobs where you prefer the MIG, so you might want both, and then the cost does go up. But if you're doing clean metal work, 99% of the time, the TIG is the tool we go to. Yes, if you're doing MOT repair, just slapping a sill onto something, whatever, yeah, maybe the MIG would be better. But for most other work, TIG would be better. So that addresses that one. I would just buy the TIG and just get a cheap one. It'll do anything you want to do on body panel work. And the other question was referring to picking up on the fact that there was some repairs that we'd done using, in fact there's two more things. Another one was some repairs that we'd done where we had used a MIG and we had done little welds and then waited for it to cool and bits more weld. They were incidences when we can't get at the back of the weld, and then you have to shortcut the job. You can't really do it properly. The solution then is just to minimise the distortion by hardly putting any heat in, freeze the weld by just putting a tiny bit of MIG in at a time, freeze it all. It builds up tension in the panel. It's not the right way to do it, but if you cannot get at the back of the weld to planish it up, to stretch it back to shape, then you can freeze it all in position by using the MIG. It's not a great way of doing it, but you can get yourself out of a pickle if you can't get at the back. So that addresses that. And then the final question that I saw asked, which was a very, very good point, was that last week we covered a long continuous weld across the rear floor on the Land Cruiser. And there was a question about why did we do that long continuous weld across the floor on their Land Cruiser when Toyota would never have done that? And you're quite right, Toyota never would have done that because there was no weld seam in that position originally. The reason we put a continuous weld there is so that we can clean it on both sides and you'll never know the floor's been joined there because we did a part panel replacement. The panel actually carried on further forward than that and was spot welded about 3 inches forward of where we put the weld seam. But we wanted to, there was no point taking that point that far forward, and the repair panel we used didn't go that far forward. And it didn't need to either. There was no problem there, it just didn't need to go that far forward. So we did a butt weld, a TIG butt continuous weld across the floor at that position, and then clean the weld off so there's no evidence of it ever having been welded, and then it looks like one panel again. So no, we weren't trying to replicate an original Toyota joint. We were basically putting a join in a panel that didn't originally have a join in and then hiding it by cleaning it off, and so the weld's invisible afterwards. So that's why there was a continuous weld. No, we wouldn't normally put a continuous weld into a panel at a joint where there was an original factory join. We would either spot weld it, stitch weld it, plug weld it, whatever, but we certainly wouldn't, no, we wouldn't continuous weld it. No, it's just because we were joining a panel. So that addresses those questions there. That's why we've done that. But yeah, that's where we are with Land Cruiser. Tom's saved metal finished all that now. That's absolutely fine. That would be ready for prep and paint, that repair now. I'll say not perfect, but it's very close to. So really happy with that. So moving on, we'll stroll around to the Morris, and I'll swing around here. I'm going to try and remember everything. I know various things that Stu's been doing on this. He's been doing a little bit more work on the front of the car. I'll walk to the back and then gesticulate to the front. I know Jamie's got some decent bits of footage of Stu finishing off again, last week we covered the reinforcer in the underbonnet area that stops the wings of the bonnet flapping and also mounts the two catches that we're using to latch the bonnet down. It's become a bit of an engineering, it's become a bit of a heavy engineering project, that bonnet catch assembly, but it's now all finished and done. Stu's just finished putting the safety catch on it today, I noticed because he was showing me. So he's just finished putting the safety catch arrangement on, but he's also welded in and spot welded in all of the actual reinforcer assembly into the back of the bonnet, bonded and spot welded all that into the back of the bonnet now. So we're really pleased with that. That's working very well. There's a lot of work gone into it. It's an expensive way of making a bonnet latch, one would have to say, but it's really very cool and really nice, and a really nice setup, and it works. And we're very happy with the end result. It's been a long time getting there, but we're very, very happy with the end result. That was in no part due to how Stu's worked on it. That was entirely down to the fact that it is quite a complicated thing to achieve, to do what we wanted to do with it. So that's the front end complete, and then in the back to the old problem that we faced most of the way through, the post-chassis design of this car is space. There is no space in it, it's tiny. So we want a reasonable sized fuel tank because the owner plans on doing a reasonable distances of driving in it. He lives in Scotland and he's planning on doing some reasonable distances of driving in it. And he also wants a spare wheel. Now we're having a space saver spare. There's absolutely no way you get a full size spare in. We're having a space saver spare, but obviously this area in the middle, we're fighting for space with the underside of the car with the silencer because there's very little room for a silencer underneath the car. So we're putting a very large silencer, well there is a very large silencer that goes, built by Simpson Exhaust, that goes underneath the car in this slightly raised section that we put in to allow for the silencer. The complication is we need to get the spare wheel in there. And also, the owner wants a reasonable sound system in the car, including a subwoofer. We were trying to get that in the boot. It just isn't happening. There is no space physically in the boot. She now moved to mounting that inside the car in the rear bulkhead assembly. That's going to have a trim panel, which kind of builds into mounting and the subwoofer's mounted behind it. That all goes into the rear bulkhead panel there. So we've had to abandon the idea of putting it in the boot. It just will not fit. In terms of the fuel tank, we're putting a little cutout in the bottom of the fuel tank. Obviously, the fuel tank's not made yet. There's a preliminary drawing on CAD. We've checked for fit, checked to be able to make sure, because obviously you've got to be able to make sure you can actually get it in and out of the boot, which is the other thing. It'd be very easy to draw it and find you can't actually fit it in and out. So it fits in and out. It has the capacity we need. The outlet goes through this little recess here, and so the fuel pumps sit under the car. There's a little recess there that the surge tank drops into as you fit the tank, so there's enough height to get the tank in and then drop it through that. Anyway, all that waffle. The tank fits in there, that's great, but we've got to get a spare wheel in. That needed to fit between the rear catch and the tank. Now we're actually putting a little recess in the tank to allow the wheel to tuck in and then sit just above this mount that Stu's made here, which will carry a strap. And then he's put two more little strap mounts down here on the corners of this strong raised section here, so all the stresses get loaded into the right area. And then he's built this rather nice, almost excessively nice, but if you're going to do something, you do it properly. He's made a little saddle for the space saver tyre to sit into there that also carries, that was also an extension of the original bonnet catch mount. So that all sits in at the bottom there, and then the tyre straps down. It pulls it into that, and it's tucked under the tank at the top. So it's super safe. Even in a pretty major accident, that's all well restrained. Nothing can fly out. We're very happy with the way that's all worked out. As I say, there's a few bits of almost excessive engineering in there, but again, if you're going to do it right, if you're going to do it, we might as well just make it pretty, make a sort of art piece of it, and just make it neat and do it right. And it's all there now. We're very happy with that. He's also then been fitting various tabs. He'd done some before for trims. He's been adding some various other tabs for holding various bits of trim in place, just so that once the fuel tank's in and everything else is in, then we can put the trims in to give us a tiny luggage space. It would be very tiny with the spare wheel in. Obviously, you can beach the spare wheel and have a bit more luggage space if you do it. You can pick and choose between tiny luggage and spare wheel, or no spare wheel and a bit more luggage. That's your choice. So that's pretty much. We are pretty much there. There's a bit of final fettling on bits of metalwork, but I think the list is pretty well getting ticked off now. There's not a lot left to do. So that's coming on quite well. And that's pretty much it for the metalwork progress this week. Paint booth saga continues. Not even going to go into that, but all I will say is I remember going back sometime when we were working in the assembly shop. There were a number of comments saying, "Why are you doing things like painting floors and digging holes yourselves? Why don't you get people in to do it?" All I'll say is the current work is a perfect explanation of why we do everything ourselves. And on that note, until next time, see you soon, like and subscribe, and we shall see you again next week.